one final point in my beginning remarks, though, is about the theme of today's conversation is about authoritarianism versus democracy. And certainly having lived in China and now Taiwan, I can see how important that is. But I also think as journalists, it's important to think, you know, there are so many stories in the world today, so many very important stories that I think require us to go beyond that framework as well. And that doesn't mean abandoning our commitment to democracy or pretending that both sides know what the truth is or anything like that. But I just think some of the greatest challenges to the world today and to this region sort of go beyond that framework. It means that when we want to become journalists, when we train our journalists, we also have to think about the specialist expertise that they need to deal with the challenges of the world today. And of course, the most obvious one, I think, is global warming and climate change. The policies that will be needed to address global warming, they're all about politics and ultimately about democracy and authoritarianism, but the science is a science. And I think for subjects like that, it's also very important for aspiring journalists, rising journalists, student journalists to also start understanding those topics that aren't necessarily part of something that we absorb from reading newspapers every day. It's very important, I think, that journalists become conversant with these subjects that require some effort to understand, and that's global warming. Of course, the other big lesson that we've had from the past 4 years is COVID as well. I don't think any of us ever thought we'd have to become at least mildly expert about coronaviruses and public health, but we've all had to become experts. Well, not experts, but to get to know what the subjects are. And so I think it's very important that we keep our minds open beyond that framework of democracy versus authoritarianism and understand that a vigorous democratic media also requires journalists who are expert on these topics. Expert at explaining complex subjects to a general readership, I think, is what we're looking for. So just finally, back to China, I just want to leave you with some remarks about working on China today, and just a couple of remarks to sort of provoke the conversation that we're going to have. I actually think one of the biggest difficulties that people have in understanding China, understanding authoritarian countries in general, is where does their support come from? Often when we talk about China, talk about Russia, talk about all other authoritarian countries, naturally we're very focused on their systems of repression, silence, censorship, arrests, as Thompson is talking about in Myanmar. And without sliding that at all, I think it's also important to understand, certainly in a country like China, the fact is that the Chinese regime rests on more than pure coercion and force. There are populations in China who are dependent on the government. There are forces in Chinese society that foster patriotism and nationalism. There's a sense among some Chinese people that they might not like everything that the Chinese government does, but they think we're a rising power, we feel strong, we feel more confident. And so actually I think as a foreign journalist who was working in China, and Phil may have remarks on this as well, I always thought one of our biggest challenges was not so much explaining the sources of opposition to the Communist Party, but also to explaining why the hell it remains in power. Where does that support come from? And that's not to say I endorse the Communist Party or anything like that, but to say, to explain how the world is working now, how the world is changing. I do think one of our important missions is to sort of explain these societies and why people within them would accept the Communist Party or find sympathy with its values. And that's something that can be very difficult for a foreign journalist to do. Often the people most willing to talk to us in China would be critics of the government, naturally. And a lot of my best friends were critics, I can promise you. But I always thought it was very important for us to keep our ears attuned to those other voices in the societies as well. And that can be Russia, it can be China, it can be Myanmar even. I'm not so familiar with Myanmar. But I think that's an important part of our mission as well, is just to remember the people who want to talk to us are not necessarily just the people we want to talk to. And that's become much more difficult when we're abroad these days. And so just finally I'm probably going over time anyway, but just some concluding remarks here. Inevitably in China, when it comes to talking about journalism and democracy and authoritarianism, the main framework is, of course, it's Taiwan and China. But I think it comes through in Thompson's remarks as well, and will come through in Phil's as well. We're living in a region where there's so much diversity now, and where the stories that we have to tell are actually not just about China. My editors sometimes I feel that they think it's just about China, but the truth is that there's many other important developments in this part of the region, across Southeast Asia, across South Asia, Japan, South Korea, that sometimes get overshadowed because there's so much focus, as Thompson was saying, on the big power play, great power politics, and international media sometimes doesn't do a good job at being consistently attentive about what's happening in these other stories happening in the region. And I think it's really important for Taiwan to develop, as it is through outlets like RTI, a consistent and dedicated focus to what's happening in Southeast Asia, India, other parts of the world, and not always framing stories as America versus China. I think that's really important. And to do that, I think it's really important that we begin fostering local journalistic talent in all of these countries. And certainly I think one of the promising things I see at the New York Times now is that finally, as a newspaper, we're beginning to bring in people who come from these societies, much more so than the past. It used to be much more American, certainly much more white in many ways, but I think it's becoming much more diverse now. You'd be surprised at the number of employees we have, particularly in the United States, who come from Taiwan as well. And so I think eventually what we're going to find is that journalistic talent is going to be reflected in the kind of coverage we do through journalists who are much more attuned to the stories that they hear because they grew up in these countries. And I've spoken far too long, but I think it's time for me to turn to my former boss. Thank you.